Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Day 8 of hearings in Tranche 1, Phase 2 at the Undercover Policing Inquiry. My name is Neil Fernandez, and I am the Hearings Manager. For those of you in the virtual hearing room, please turn off both your camera and microphone, unless you're invited to speak by the chairman, as Zoom will pick up on all noises and you will be on screen. I now hand over to the chairman, Sir John Mitting, to formally start proceedings. Chairman.
Thank you. As at the beginning of every session of evidential live hearings, a recording will be played. If you're listening to it for the first time, please listen carefully. I am conducting this inquiry under a statute, the Inquiries Act 2005, which gives me the power to make orders regulating the conduct of the inquiry, including its hearings. In the exercise of that power, I have made a number of orders which affect what you may and may not do in the hearing rooms and after you leave them. Breach of any of the orders is a serious matter and may have serious consequences for you. If I am satisfied that a person may have breached an order, I have the power to certify the matter to the High Court, which will investigate and deal with it as if it had been a contempt of that court. If satisfied that a breach has occurred and merits the imposition of a penalty, the High Court may impose a severe sanction on the person in breach, including a fine, imprisonment for up to 2 years, and sequestration of their assets. Evidence is going to be given live over screens in the hearing rooms. It is strictly prohibited to photograph or record what is shown on the screens or to record what is said by a witness or anyone else in the hearing rooms. You may bring your mobile telephone into the hearing rooms, but you may not use it for any of those purposes. You may use it silently for any other purpose. In particular, you may transmit your account of what you have seen and heard in a hearing room to any other person, but only once at least 10 minutes have elapsed since the event which you are describing took place. This restriction has a purpose. In the course of the inquiry, I have made orders prohibiting the public disclosure of information, for example, about the identity of a person for a variety of reasons. These orders must be upheld. It is inevitable that whether by accident or design, information which I have ordered should not be publicly disclosed will sometimes be disclosed in a hearing. If and when that happens, I will immediately suspend the hearing and make an order prohibiting further disclosure of the information outside the hearing rooms. The consequence will be that no further disclosure of that information may be made by mobile telephone or other portable electronic device from within the hearing room or by any means outside it. I am sorry if you find this message alarming. It is not intended to be. Its purpose is simply to ensure that everyone knows the rules which must apply if I am to hear the evidence which I need to enable me to get to the truth about undercover policing. You, as members of the public, are entitled to hear the same public evidence as I will hear and to reach your own conclusions about it. The inquiry team will do their best to ensure that you can. If you have any doubt about the terms of this message or what you may or may not do, you should not hesitate to ask one of them, and with my help if necessary, they will provide you with the answer. Lord Hain, I'm afraid you have rather a long day ahead of you. Do you wish to swear or to affirm?
I'd like to affirm, Sir John.
Certainly. Then may the relevant words be read to you for you to repeat, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Lord Hain. Can you see and hear me?
I can.
I understand that you would like to affirm.
That's right.
Thank you. Please repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Lord Hain. Chairman?
Mr. Bart. Thank you, sir. Lord Hain, could you first of all confirm your full name, please?
Peter Gerald Hain, or the Right Honourable Lord Hain of Neath.
Thank you. You've provided the inquiry with a comprehensive witness statement dated the 3rd of March 2020. Are the contents of that witness statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
Can we start, please, with an overview, insofar as it is relevant to our terms of reference, of your career as an activist and in politics? Is it right that you were active within the anti-apartheid movement between 1967 and 1994, including serving on that movement's national committee?
Yes, it is.
Turning to the Young Liberals, is it right that you were active with the Young Liberals from 1968? You were the publicity vice chair between 1969 and 1970. You were the national chair between 1971 and 1973. You were a national executive member between 1973 and 1975, and the national president between 1975 and 1977.
Yes, with one correction, I think I was publicity vice chair between 1970 and 1971. Otherwise, all those dates and positions are correct.
Thank you. So far as the Stop the 70 tour is concerned, you were the national chair of that organization between September 1969 and May of 1970.
Yes.
Was that for the entire history of the organization?
Pretty well, yes, it was. From the time it was launched publicly in September 1969 until we disbanded it in late May 1970.
You were then active in the Action Committee Against Racialism between 1970 and 1973, including as chair.
Yes.
You were a founder member and the national press officer between 1977 and 1981 for the Anti-Nazi League.
I was.
And you were the parliamentary officer for that organization from 1991 onwards.
Yes.
You joined the Labour Party in September of 1977 and you were a member of Parliament between 1991 and 2015, a government minister for 5 years and a cabinet minister for 7 years.
Yes.
One of your cabinet portfolios was as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland.
Yes.
And that included signing off work of the utmost sensitivity.
Indeed, signing warrants for surveillance and interception, and also seeing intelligence reports from GCHQ and the security service of the utmost sensitivity indeed. And when I was a Minister of State in the Foreign Office, I saw similarly sensitive intelligence reports from both GCHQ and MI6 between 1999 and 2003.
And amongst the information crossing your desk would have been at least some about the activities of undercover police officers.
Yes, it would.
You've been a Privy Councillor since 2001 and a member of the House of Lords since 2015.
Yes.
Can I move now to some scene setting, because we have to move ourselves from 2021 to 1969. Would it be right to say that the anti-apartheid movement in the late 1960s and the 1970s could, on the one hand, command large numbers of active protesters, but on the other hand, was a long way from being as mainstream as it is today?
Yes, Mr. Barr, that's a very important point, because at that time, although today we regard apartheid as being part of history, at that time, and for many decades prior to Nelson Mandela's release in 1990 and the eventual negotiation to ending apartheid with his presidency in 1994, for 50 years or so, it was a bitter, long, hard struggle, and we were in a minority. And people take it for granted that everybody was against apartheid because it was such a detestable, institutionalized system of racism like the world has never seen. People take it for granted that we were all, as it were, on the side of the anti-apartheid movement, but that was not the case. You quite correctly depicted it as being a movement that was in a minority, albeit with a wide reservoir of public sympathy.
And is it right that an important part of the explanation for that was the Cold War and a fear that was held by Western governments of South Africa coming under communist influence?
Well, the Cold War prism through which the anti-apartheid struggle was seen was a very big part of the context in which we worked. But it was the South African apartheid state that presented itself as a bulwark against communism in its own language. And that was very convenient for us, because in fact, it was responsible for one of the most vicious tyrannies that the world has ever seen, where a minority, less than 10% of the population, oppressed the great majority on grounds of race. And it suited its purposes that Washington and London and Berlin and Paris and Rome saw it as part of a contest between the Soviet Union and the democratic West, saw it as being on the side of the democratic West, when in fact it wasn't a democratic regime, the very opposite. And it was, it went against all the principles of democracy, including not having a democracy, because the majority were not allowed to participate or vote and were denied the most elementary human rights. So when you asked the question about the way the anti-apartheid movement saw itself and was seen, it was through a distorted prism. We were on the side of justice, inequality, and human rights, and the apartheid regime was on the wrong side of all of those issues. And yet, Washington and London in particular, but Paris and Berlin and Rome and other centers of a so-called Western democracy, were actually allied to the South African apartheid regime, supplying it with arms, continuing to trade with it, opposing sanctions, and in particular campaigns that I was involved in, opposing sporting boycotts. So it was very convenient for the apartheid regime that prism was the way that we were seen, but very distorted as well of the true character of the anti-apartheid struggle, or, for example, Nelson Mandela's true beliefs.
And moving now to you personally, you grew up in South Africa in the apartheid regime. As a child, you came to this country in the 1960s with your family. And at the point at which we begin our exploration in 1969, you were living with your family in Putney.
That's correct. My parents were very unusually, as young white South African born a conventional parents and conventional family in many other respects, but very unusually took a stand against the apartheid system and suffered continual harassment, jailing, issued with banning orders. And eventually my father, as an architect, was prevented from working. The government effectively issued an edict that nobody could employ him. So we were forced to come into exile and were accepted as British subjects, though my father attained his own citizenship through his father, who was from Glasgow. And we settled in London in 1966, not out of choice, but because of the attacks that we suffered as a family from the apartheid regime.
And I know this is a point which you have made very forcefully in your witness statement, but I think it bears drawing out here. And I will ask you it as an open question. Were you or either of your parents communists?
No, my parents were both members of the South African Liberal Party, whose president was Alan Paton of Cry the Beloved Country and other renowned books. They joined in 1954. They were never members of the South African Communist Party, nor was I, even though undercover officers and the evidence that I've seen to which you alluded specifically described them as communists in the case of one report held by the Metropolitan Police, and appeared to give detail that could only have come from South African sources. And of course, the South African Security Service banned my parents, both of them, my mother in 1963, my father in 1964, under the Suppression of Communism Act, even though they were members of the Liberal Party. So yes, that was another distortion of through the prism of the Cold War, that everybody almost who supported the anti-apartheid case was seen and designated by the apartheid state and its allies in London and Washington in the main as communist sympathizers or actual communists. I mean, that was a straight lie. And it even says about me, I may quote from it actually, it even says that I, although not a member of the CP, the South African Communist Party, because of my age, was clearly associated with the South African Communist Party, and in spite of his youth, was suspected to have taken part in Communist Party underground activities. Well, those are all lies, but very typical of the kind of reports that undercover officers were making at the time about the anti-apartheid movement and its members, including me.
One final preliminary question before we move to your activism in this country. In 1969, how old were you?
I was 19.
I'm going to start with, on the topic of activism, with the Wilf Isaacs 11. And the Wilf Isaac was a businessman who sponsored a cricket tour to this country. Is that right?
He was, and I think also an officer in the South African Army.
We travelled first to Basildon on the 5th of July 1969. And it's right, isn't it, that you were one of 8 young liberals who staged a pitch invasion at Basildon?
Yes, I was, and I organised it, and I'm proud to recall it. And we staged a pitch invasion. We ran on the pitch during play, sat down, unfurled banners, and were carried off perfectly non-violently, as was always my intention and was proved by that protest in particular. It was, as far as I know, the first such anti-apartheid protest of a non-violent direct action character against a cricket team, and presaged the subsequent Stop the 72 campaign.
Just while we introduce non-violent direct action, I think it's important we're clear about terms and definitions. You make it abundantly clear in your witness statement that non-violent meant exactly what it said. So you were not setting out, it was your deliberate policy not to occasion violence to any person. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. It was shown by that Basildon incident. We didn't attempt to interfere with any individual. We ran on and stopped the play, and we were carried off. And you'll probably come to this. A similar protest took place at a tennis court in Bristol as well, of the same character. I see non-violent direct action of the kind that I advocated and participated in and led through the Stop the 72 campaign as having a long lineage, going back to the suffragettes, to early trade unionists, to the Chartists protesting for the vote, to Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi in India, protesting against British colonial rule and for Indian independence. It's in a long line of non-violent direct action that's also carried out by Extinction Rebellion and other environmental protests today.
And whilst it is unequivocally non-violent, it's also right to say that non-violent direct action does not mean it is lawful.
Well, nothing we did at the time, that I did at the time, ever invited a prosecution. I was not prosecuted during these protests, either the Basildon one or the Bristol one, where I ran on a tennis court, or during the Stop the 72 campaign. I was subsequently prosecuted for criminal conspiracy as a result of a private prosecution. But most of the things we did were not unlawful. Running on a cricket pitch was not a criminal act. It may have been a civil trespass, but that was not a criminal act in itself.
Accepting what you've just said, that doesn't quite answer my question, though. I mean, the philosophy of non-violent direct action did leave room for protesters who felt very strongly about the issue to use tactics which would involve them committing minor criminal offences to advance their cause. That's correct, isn't it?
If it's part of your line of argument that you're seeking to suggest that non-violent direct action, as it were, has a, if I could put it, a subversive periphery, I reject that. Non-violent direct action is also in the context of civil disobedience. And that is to say, like Mahatma Gandhi did under British rule, you accept the consequences if there is a transgression of the law, but you're not seeking to break the law. You're simply seeking to take action that you believe, as I believed, and I'm still proud that I did, a non-violent direct action to change the course of history. And we did change the course of history. That Stop the 72 campaign was fundamental, as Nelson Mandela subsequently told me, having seen it or heard about it from Robben Island, where he was at the time. It was fundamental in changing the nature of the anti-apartheid movement, in galvanizing it, and in ultimately bringing about the downfall of apartheid.
I can assure you, Lord Hain, I'm not in any way trying to detract from the achievements of the Stop the 70 tour or other NVDA actions. What I'm seeking to do is to draw the distinction between the way that a group that is using non-violent direct action achieves its aims and the way that a group which uses entirely conventional protesting techniques, perhaps such as the anti-apartheid movement. That's the distinction I'm getting at.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Barr, and I'm happy to accept it. The anti-apartheid movement engaged in conventional mainstream protest. To agree with your point, it organized rallies in Trafalgar Square. It organized peaceful demonstrations, including outside Twickenham, when Stop the 72 demonstrators were inside trying to invade the pitch. It organized petitions, it organized non-violent pickets outside sporting grounds, and it made representations to government, and it sought to have issues raised in Parliament, all mainstream pressure group activity. Yes, whereas the Stop the 72 campaign, in addition to doing some of those things, was also distinctive and unique up to that point in the anti-apartheid struggle in Britain, at least, of undertaking non-violent direct action of the kind I've described.
And we'll see more of that as we go through the chronology. I've got a copy of your book, Don't Play with Apartheid, in front of me. You wrote that book it was first published in 1971, is that right?
That's correct.
And presumably when you wrote it, the events were fresh in your memory and we can rely upon them.
I hope so.
So far as the Basildon match is concerned, one of the things you write is, you say, the importance of the occasion was not, however, matched by any great competence on our part, but the authorities were taking it seriously, and the whole area was teeming with police constables, squad cars, motorbikes, and a mobile radio headquarters. It seemed that they were expecting demonstrators to emerge phoenix-like from the surrounding countryside. And what they got was you and 7 of your young Liberal colleagues.
Exactly.
And is that sort of reaction what you were seeking? I gather from the book that you thought that was something of a success.
Well, it was completely disproportionate and a complete waste of police resources, in my view. They should have been spent catching criminals and other mainstream policing activity. And that, frankly, is an example of an argument that you'll probably hear from me later on in my evidence if there's scope for that. But undoubtedly, the non-violent direct action that I advocated and participated in did excite a police interest, of course. But if you look at actually what happened, what we intended, Mr. Barr, and then the police numbers, they are completely disproportionate. And all of the undercover officer that we work involved in the anti-apartheid movement, including in the Stop the 70 tour, was completely disproportionate. Those resources should have been deployed catching terrorists, catching drug traffickers, catching people traffickers, and organized serious crime, serious criminals, not devoted to keeping an eye on and harassing in various ways legitimate anti-apartheid protests.
Let's move from Basildon to Oxford, which is, I think, the next match in the Wilf Isaacs tour. I'm reading from your book. In their second match at Oxford, the Wilf Isaacs 11 faced its most disruptive protest. In a well-drilled operation, over 70 protesters, members of Oxford Anti-Apartheid, students, trade unionists, and others, ran onto the pitch at the sound of a whistle and stopped the match for over 40 minutes, causing play to be abandoned for the day. 3 days before this, the pitch had been dug up in an attempt to force the abandonment of the match, but groundsmen were able to repair it in time. Is that a reasonably typical example of the sort of tactics that were used?
Digging up the pitch was not something I ever advocated. In fact, I opposed it. I didn't agree with it, but that did happen. Was it typical? It didn't happen at Basildon, and it didn't happen, as I recall, at any other Wilf Isaacs matches, unless you can correct me from my book in 1971. For instance, when I led a group of young Liberals, including my sisters and brother, to invade a pitch in Roehampton, the pitch wasn't dug up, but there was an effective protest.
Just before we move on to the Stop the 70 tour, and for the sake of completeness, and so that we get tennis in as well as rugby and cricket, I think you had staged a sit-in protest with others on the tennis court at a Davis Cup match prior to the Stop the 70 campaign, hadn't you?
Yes, I had. Again, a small group of us bought tickets, sat in the stands, and ran on to this match between an all-white tennis team representing South Africa. Remember, of course, South African tennis players, rugby players, cricket players, any Olympics athletes, any representative of South Africa could only be white. That was the nature of apartheid at the time. And yes, we did interrupt the match and were carried out. And I was detained in a police cell for a bit and then told to go home.
And I think, to be clear, I think it's emerged from your evidence, but I'd just like to confirm it. Although non-violent direct action was not a new tactic, you can trace it all the way back to the suffragettes at least, it was novel in the context of campaigns in relation to sporting events and in relation to the anti-apartheid movement generally.
Yes.
And that part of its effectiveness was its novelty and the change of tactics that you brought to this field of campaigning.
Yes, up until then, there'd been pickets held, banners held up, rallies staged, letters written, petitions organized, and speeches in Parliament against white South African sports tours to Britain, including led by, for example, the former England cricket captain David Shepherd, subsequently the Bishop of Woolwich and of Liverpool, who almost uniquely in the cricketing world, apart from the cricket commentator John Arlott, took a stand. But up until that point, the protests had all been outside the stadia, as it were, rather than running on the pitch. And we'd made no progress. Apartheid in sport had been intensified. Anti-apartheid sports people who wished to play non-racial sport inside South Africa had been arrested and harassed. In other words, the situation was getting worse while the protests were conventional. And some sports officials who wanted to play non-racial sport, who advocated non-racial sport, such as members of the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee, individuals like Dennis Brutus and Chris de Broglie, were prevented, were harassed. Dennis Brutus was arrested, he was shot by the police, he was imprisoned on Robben Island. All the time, more mainstream conventional pressure activity by anti-apartheid campaigners was continuing. The situation was getting worse. And I advocated non-violent direct action to change that, to make a fundamental rupture in the way that sports relations of a racist apartheid kind were continuing between Britain and South Africa and other countries such as New Zealand, Australia, in the main, to change that. And we did succeed in changing that, because as a result of the Stop the 70 Tour campaign, as we'll no doubt come to, South African cricketers and rugby players never toured again until after Nelson Mandela had come out of prison, until after negotiations had begun for a transition from a tyrannical apartheid regime to a non-racial democracy. And then South Africa was permitted to come back into international sport in a way that I welcomed. So my point is, until non-violent direct action was instigated, and I probably bear responsibility and proudly do so if that's the case, for instigating it and leading it, until that happened, things had been getting worse. Inside the country, sports officials killed, harassed, banned, forced into exile, imprisoned. Until that point, we'd begun to get progress.
Lord Hain, I don't know whether you can hear me, but your voice, I'm afraid there was an interruption in the quality of the audio channel, and we missed, I think, about the last 20 seconds of your answer.
Thank you for, I wasn't aware of that, but I'm grateful. I was simply making the point that up until the phase of non-violent direct action which I led through the Stop the 70 Tour campaign, but was participated in by tens of thousands of others, so I'm not alone responsible at all, and nor would ever claim to be. Up until that point, things in sport in South Africa were getting worse. It was becoming more racist. Sports officials who wanted an anti-apartheid sports system inside the country were being jailed and banned and imprisoned, including on Robben Island, and harassed and forced into exile. after we stopped the 1970 cricket tour, that began to change.
Thank you for that introduction, because I'm now going to move to the Stop the 70 tour. And to be crystal clear, the aim was to stop the Springbok rugby tour, to stop the South African cricket team touring, and to isolate white South African sport and therefore contribute to toppling the apartheid system.
Absolutely. To be more precise, the name reveals the objective. It was to stop the 1970 cricket tour, stop the 70 tour campaign. But in the meantime, the Springbok rugby tour, which arrived in October 1969 and played 20 odd matches until the end of January, then became the target to try and show that we could disrupt a rugby tour and therefore achieve our objective of stopping the cricket tour, either if it came, but preferably before it did. So that's just, as it were, a clarification of the otherwise accurate description you've given.
Thank you for that. And this operation was, if I've understood your witness statement correctly, essentially run from your parents' flat.
It was. My mother became the unofficial secretary, though the official secretary was Hugh Geach, a Reading University student who played an important part. But yes, it was run from our flat at 21A Gwendolyn Avenue in Putney, because there was no other headquarters for the organization. I think it's important just to understand, Mr. Barr, without taking too much of your time or Sir John's time, that this was a campaign that lifted off out of nowhere and suddenly became a massive nationwide campaign. And it was very spontaneous, very decentralized. If the Springboks were going to Manchester, then Manchester anti-apartheid activists would organize there. I wouldn't do that. If they went to Swansea, then the Wales anti-apartheid movement would do that, and so on in, I think, 25 matches around Britain and one in Dublin. So it was very decentralized, very autonomous. There was no central command and control, and to that extent, no central conspiratorial direction from me, though I provided leadership and leaflets and publicity of that kind.
Thank you. Can you help us with then the role of the Putney flat? Who was it who was meeting in the Putney flat?
Meetings of the National Stop the 70 Tour committee took place in my parents' living room whilst they retired to their bedrooms or the kitchen. It was quite a modest flat with 4 children, of whom I was the eldest, and my mother and father. The meetings were held there, and our telephone was effectively the telephone number for the national campaign of the STST movement, and letters arrived at the flat. So it effectively was the campaign headquarters. It wasn't particularly intended that way. It wasn't planned that way. But my mother effectively became, as I say, the unofficial secretary. Completely, all of her time, virtually, apart from family matters, was taken up with that voluntary role.
And it may become important later. So whilst we're scene setting, can you give us some idea of how big the living room was?
In memory, I would think it was 20 odd feet by about 10 feet. It might have been 21 feet. It was reasonably large, but not massive.
Now, as you've described a highly decentralized group with your small national committee operating from the living room of your parents' flat, it's right to say that in addition to it being a rather, I hope I'm not insulting you, amorphous, decentralized group, it also was affiliated to a number of organizations. And I'm taking a list from your witness statement. The affiliates included the anti-apartheid movement.
They were affiliated to the Stop the 70 Tour campaign, yes, rather than the other way around.
Exactly. The National Union of Students, the National League of Young Liberals, the Student Christian Movement, the International Socialists, and the Young Communist League.
Yes, I think that was the complete list.
And so
United Nations in that list, the United Nations Youth Student Association in that list, but it should be.
Thank you. And so, again, to come back to the smears that you talked about earlier, it's right, you were not communist, the group, the STST was not communist, but you did have amongst your affiliates the Young Communist League and a Trotskyist organization, the International Socialists.
Yes, no secret about that, along with Christians and vicars and priests and bishops and a variety of people. My philosophy, Mr. Barr, always has been, whether tackling racism through the Anti-Nazi League, as we'll discuss later, or through the anti-apartheid struggle, is you bring in the broadest spectrum of opinion that you can, that shares in common a single objective of defeating apartheid or defeating racism, and that all people of goodwill rally to, who believe in that objective, can rally together, even though they may disagree about everything else. I mean, the bishops involved supporting us would have perhaps had a friendly argument with the atheists in the organization. Similarly, a young liberal like me at the time, albeit a libertarian socialist, would have had strong disagreements with Trotskyists or young communists, but that didn't stop us collaborating together.
The connection is the common cause.
The common cause, which I think, you know, if you judge it historically, was a noble cause, and we were on the right side of history, and the people who were opposing us were on the wrong side of history.
And how big was the National Committee?
It was around about 15, something like that. You had the representatives of each of the affiliates, not all of whom always attended, but meetings were around about 15, maybe a dozen sometimes, maybe a little more if extra people came in who were invited to come in.
And how did one get on to the National Committee?
You were affiliate, you sent a representative through your affiliated organization, or you were an activist who was doing a lot of work, voluntary work, and you were felt to be important to be there. And then I invited anybody in that position.
And how often did you see the National Committee?
Not that often, maybe monthly in the period from September through till September 1969 through till May 1970. We didn't spend much time in committee bureaucracy. We spent our time focused on organizing and achieving what we wanted to achieve.
How well did you know the committee members?
Reasonably well, some of them better than others. For example, Alan Brooks from the anti-apartheid movement, I knew very well. He tended to attend, sometimes others on his behalf. I knew them reasonably well, but some of them I didn't know well.
Just before we immerse ourselves further in the detail, as I understand it, we're dealing with a total of 25 Springbok fixtures and a plan for 12 cricket matches.
Yes, the original intention was to have, I think, 24 cricket matches, but that was halved in number to 12 in February 1970 as a result of a recognition by the cricket authorities at Lord's Cricket Ground, where they were based, that they couldn't actually organise successfully that number of matches at grounds that couldn't as easily be defended, in their view, as the 12 could be. So they chopped the tour in half before it was due to start, which was an early sign of our success. I think I joked that we should call it the Stop the 70 Half Tour Committee at that time.
I see. And you were quite open about what your intentions were. I'm going to read from your book again, quoting from a letter that you wrote to The Guardian on the 22nd of August of 1969. It reads, "The consequences of another refusal by the MCC to cancel the tour should not be underestimated. The token disruptions during the recent tour of the Wilf Isaacs 11 to Britain and the Davis Cup match at Bristol demonstrated the seriousness of threats to massively disrupt the 1970 tour. Next summer could see a season consisting of an endless series of protests and disruptions.
Absolutely. And remember that that tour was invited after the Basil d'Oliveira affair. You may recall that Basil d'Oliveira was a coloured in South African racial designation of mixed blood from Cape Town. So excellent a cricketer that he could easily have played for his own country, the country of his birth, but he had to come into exile to pursue his career in England and became an England test star by 1966. And by 1968 was an automatic, one of the top handful of cricketers as an automatic selection. He was then excluded from the England team due to tour South Africa at the end of 1968 on orders of the South African Prime Minister, John Vorster, who banned the tour because it was too embarrassing to have d'Oliveira in. And he was important to this and important to my letter at the time and the level of intensity that I felt about it, because here the English cricket authorities were on the back of being so badly snubbed by the South African government to stop an England team coming, chosen on merit with Basil d'Oliveira in it, because he would have illustrated the whole oppression and farcical nature of apartheid. That here was an England team coming with a South African-born cricketer who could not play for his own country. And that was stopped. And nevertheless, a few months later, the English cricket authorities invited the South Africans, the white South Africans, to tour in 1970. So that was why I felt so strongly about it. And that's why it was reflected in that letter, that they were clearly on the side of apartheid, the English cricket authorities, and the racist form of cricket that operated under that system.
The thread I'm following at the moment is what it was that you were making very clear the STST was going to do. We've got the massive disruption that is promised in the Guardian letter. I'm going to move next to the press conference at the STST.
But my point, yes, and I absolutely, and I stand by that letter, and I wouldn't rewrite a word in it from memory. But you need to understand why feelings had got to that point, why we were left with no alternative but to adopt that strategy of non-violent direct action, particularly after the Basil d'Oliveira affair.
I can tell you, it's the merits of the reasoning aren't, in fact, the inquiry's focus, the rights and wrongs of it. We're looking at the undercover policing. And so I'm going to follow But
you've got to understand the context that we were operating in.
I do, yes, I quite take that point. And I think,
I mean, I'm sure you wouldn't be, nor would Sir John be on the side of apartheid or apartheid in sport. Of course you wouldn't be. But you would therefore be with us in sentiment, I hope.
And I take all of that point, and you've explained it very clearly. I'm going to pick up now on the 10th of September and the press conference that the STST held. And I'm going to quote again from your book what you said there. We will be organising mass demonstrations and disruptions throughout the tour. Next summer's cricket season could collapse into chaos should the tour take place. We are fighting British collaboration with racialism in sport, and this is a fight we are confident of winning. We are today issuing a clear warning to British sports authorities that their complicity in apartheid sport will no longer be tolerated. All future tours, including the rugby tour, starting in November, will be severely disrupted. Now, you can take it as a given, Lord Hain, that the fact that you were on the right side of history is completely accepted.
Thank you.
What I'm following is the tactic. And the tactic is to make publicly very clear that what is coming is massive disruption.
Yes, non-violent direct action, indeed. I never hid that. I was very clear about it, public about it. Nobody could have been in any doubt about it. And the objective was to bring the cricket authorities to their senses. All the way along, wanted to stop that cricket tour from happening, from taking place. I didn't want to have to organize those protests. That was not my preference. And we'd been driven to the point, and I'd been driven to the point of making those statements and making those threats, if you like, to try and stop apartheid sports tours from happening, because no other tactics have been able to achieve those objectives.
And you had support in what you were doing from the Young Liberals, didn't you?
Yes, for the most part.
I'll give a flavour of that by reading further from your book about what they said at around the same time. I believe that this is a quote from the chair of the Young Liberals, Louis Eakes. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. He said, "I believe that many people are prepared to risk arrest and even imprisonment on this crucial issue of principle. We have asked the MCC on numerous occasions to take a reasoned stand against apartheid in sport. It is they who will be responsible if Lord's becomes the Ulster of the sporting world next summer."
Louis Eakes had a tendency for a turn of phrase that was very flamboyant and very attention-seeking. And I may add, Mr. Barr, that although I was publicly a Young Liberal and a prominent one, the Stop the 70 Tour campaign was not dominated by Young Liberals. It was we were a small part of the campaign. It was a much broader spectrum, including members of the anti-apartheid movement. And I think a number of them felt that Louis Eakes' statements at the time were rather self-promoting. I simply put that in context. I mean, he was not organizing the campaign, I was. I would not have used those words, but they undoubtedly captured attention.
Yes, no, undoubtedly arresting words. But it is right, isn't it, that a number of Young Liberals did participate in...
Oh, yes, indeed. I was a Young Liberal, and you've already described early protests, Wilf Isaacs and the tennis match, for example, which were undertaken by Young Liberals.
And one of the reasons that your campaign was so powerful is the importance of international sport to people and the profile of international sporting events. Is that fair?
Yes, it was. Because if you like, in traditional newspaper terms, the story was not simply going to be tucked away in the news pages of a demonstration. It would be on the sports pages as well. And because sport was being focused upon, because apartheid sports tours were happening in our own country, selected on a racist basis, of course, that would attract extra attention, therefore extra pressure and extra mobilization for a successful campaign, which we were able to achieve.
And you've explained very graphically, if I may say so, the strength of feeling amongst the anti-apartheid campaigners, including yourself. But it's fair to say also that interrupting high-profile sporting matches evinces strong emotions from amongst the supporters, to which we will return.
Yes, most couldn't understand why we were doing it. They simply saw their rugby or their cricket being interrupted and didn't understand it. And there was a bit of a dialogue of the deaf in that respect. And in fact, I've had lots of people, I won't take your time, but about too much of your time, but I have lots of people after Nelson Mandela came out of prison who would stop me in the street or on the underground in London or wherever, just quite unexpectedly, and say, look, I hated you at the time for what you did to rugby and cricket, but I now understand why you did it and have changed my mind. So, but at the time, yes, it did undoubtedly provoke a great deal of criticism and opposition, and indeed anger from sports fans who were deprived of what they loved, and I understand that.
I see. Well, now let's descend into the detail of how your promise to massively disrupt things began to materialize. We're going back to Oxford, this time the 23rd of October, 1969. And again, reading from your book, suddenly the campaign exploded into action and into prominence. It was announced on the 23rd of October that weed killer had been sprayed on Oxford University's rugby ground, just a week before the team was due to arrive. The words "Oxford rejects apartheid" appeared in 5-foot letters on the pitch. The next day, the University Rugby Club officials called off the match. They said that they had taken this decision after consultations with the Thames Valley Police, quote, because of the risk of violence, unquote. And does that fairly summarise what happened at Oxford?
What doesn't summarise it fairly is the risk of violence. The Oxford Anti-Apartheid Group, which organised this quite independently of me, I might add, with my general approval, though I was never a fan of spraying weed killer anywhere. But the Oxford Anti-Apartheid Movement was not intending violence. It was intending to adopt the same non-violent direct action tactics that it had adopted during the Wilf Isaacs tour, except on a much, much bigger scale. And that was why the game was cancelled and the venue was transferred.
Accepting completely that the STST's line was very strongly and unequivocally anti-violence. There was nevertheless...
When you say our line, that was our agenda and our objective. It was very public. It wasn't some kind of convenient, as it were, sophistry. It was a very publicly stated, committed philosophy of the whole organization from its outset.
Principle. A principle, would you agree?
A principle, yes, yes.
But accepting that, emotions running high on both sides, there is the potential for violence, isn't there? Not inevitably, no. If the response from the police and any stewarding of the ground is proportionate, no. When, for example, two of my friends ran on the pitch at Twickenham in December 1969, and one of them managed to, the other tried unsuccessfully to chain themselves to the rugby posts, they were not seeking to provoke violence. They were indulging in classic non-violent direct action. When I jumped over or tried to get over the fence at Twickenham, the barrier onto the pitch between the spectator stand and the pitch, I wasn't trying to provoke violence. I was trying to get onto the pitch and I wasn't trying to fight with anybody. And when the police grabbed me and carried me out, I didn't resist it. I didn't seek to inflict any harm on the police officers who were doing their job. I was simply trying to get onto the pitch to stop an apartheid rugby match. Going to move now to the 26th of October and the anti-apartheid movement's annual general meeting for 1969. Did you see Christabel Gurney's evidence yesterday?
I saw a summary of it.
She was questioned on and described the links, or to be more precise, the lack of any formal link between the SDST and the SDST's non-violent direct action and the anti-apartheid movement. Did you see that part of her evidence?
Yeah, she was correct about that.
Thank you. Can we now move then to the arrival of the Springboks on the 30th of October, 1960?
By the way, that anti-apartheid movement annual general meeting had intelligence operatives in it. I think South African security operatives tape recording the whole thing and collaborating with the British Special Branch and other intelligence operations, including presumably by undercover officers. They were working together.
I'm going to move to the arrival of the Springboks on the 30th of October 1969. And there is an account in your book that I'm going to read now. It reads, early on the Thursday morning, the Reading group took the initiative when about 30 of them staged a protest at the team's arrival. They chanted slogans and paraded with banners as the players climbed into their coach. There were scuffles as a small group of South Africans who had come to welcome the team exchanged blows with an airport official. STST's secretary, Hugh Geach, who had organised the demonstration, afterwards made the statement which dogged the Springboks throughout the tour. He said, quote, "We are going to hound them everywhere they go." This airport protest will also be remembered for the slogan used by the demonstrators, which caused so much mirth amongst non-white South Africans: "Don't scrum with a racist bum."
Yes, and I'd simply add to that accurate description that you'll notice that the Stop the 70 tour protests at Heathrow Airport were perfectly peaceful and were not engaged in any violent act at all.
Thank you. And it's right, isn't it, that the movement made good on its promise to hound the South Africans every step of the way, because the very next day, Halloween 1969, there were protests at the first training session. Again, I'll read from your book. At their first training session early the following morning, the Springboks were again greeted by STST demonstrators. The demonstration had in fact been organised on the spur of the moment by my family when they heard that the practice session was to take place near our home. The session was briefly interrupted by a small local STST group receiving massive press and television coverage. In the evening, jeering and picketing demonstrators greeted the team as it arrived for a reception at the South African embassy in a protest organised by the anti-apartheid movement. Both of these relatively minor protests received wide publicity, principally because of the unpredictable nature of our direct action threats. Is that fair?
Yes.
And I want to pick up on that thread of the unpredictable nature. It's a combination, isn't it, of the unpredictable nature of the threat and the fact that the tactics being used go beyond the conventional that make these protests so effective.
Yes, but it doesn't make them violent or lead to violence. There's a very important distinction to be made there, which I hope you'll accept.
Indeed. And from the point of view of policing, though, it does make them very difficult to police.
Well, if there'd been cooperation from the police, that might not have been the case. But I accept that. But I also accept, as I hope with historical hindsight will be accepted by this inquiry, that these protests were necessary to change the course of history, which they did. And I don't mean that any means justifies the ends. Otherwise, I'd have a different philosophy about a lot of things. But I don't believe that any means justifies the ends, or out of advocated violence, for example, if I'd thought that would have achieved the objective. But the police have got to decide when facing anti-apartheid protests of this kind on whose side they are. Are they on the side of apartheid, or are they on the side of the anti-apartheid movement? And in many cases, in respect of undercover officers, they made the wrong choice. They sought to harass and infiltrate us rather than dealing with agents of apartheid in London who were bombing the headquarters of Nelson Mandela's African National Congress in 1982, and who were also fire an arson attack on the anti-apartheid movement's headquarters in 1985, and a number of other attacks, including on me, by sending me a letter bomb. And the police really, in targeting us and our protests, were putting themselves on the wrong side of history, in my view.
I'm going to come back at the end to these very interesting themes about the relevance of the justice of the cause and so forth, and proportionality. At the moment, I'd like to pick up on the thread of cooperation with the police. It's right, isn't it, that because the unpredictability of the action is part of its potency, that you weren't telling the police in advance what you were going to do. Quite the contrary.
If we were organising a protest outside the ground of a conventional rally march, then you would talk to the police about that so that it was policed effectively, it took place effectively, and it took place peacefully. If we were seeking to run on the pitch, obviously, I wouldn't ring up the police commander and tell him, though I had perfectly civil relations with Commander Gerard some of the time. So no, absolutely fair point. The novelty, the surprise of the non-violent direct action was its potency, and I make no secret of that. Indeed, that's why we adopted it.
I'm going to move now to Swansea on the 15th of November 1969, and this is where things go wrong, isn't it? Very wrong, but not because of our action at all, as no doubt I'll be given an opportunity to explain. Indeed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, I could cover it from your book. I'm going to give you an opportunity, though. I know you weren't there in person, but you were close to events. Could you describe what happened? There was a march outside the St Helens Stadium in Swansea on that Saturday against the match organised by the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement. There were then some members of the Wales Anti-Apartheid Movement, but principally Stop the 70 Tour student activists who travelled down to Swansea to run on the pitch in the way that we've described and was our principal objective. They ran on, they sat down, they interrupted play for, as I recall, over 10 minutes as was intended. They were then carried off by the police and thrown to rugby stewards, rugby vigilantes, if you like, recruited for these purposes and thoroughly beaten up. And a friend of mine had his jaw broken, a young woman demonstrator nearly lost an eye. There were serious injuries suffered by non-violent protesters. That didn't need to happen. They could have been carried out of St Helens, but there was clearly a pre-planned attempt to beat the hell out of the protesters, and that's what happened. And as a result of that, independent newspaper reports, for example, in the Times, which was hostile to the tactics of non-violent direct action editorially, nevertheless said that the policing and the behavior of the rugby stewards was completely out of control and unacceptable. And I led a delegation to the Home Office and met the Minister of State with a small delegation with a petition describing it in some graphic detail, as a result of which policing was changed. And there was nothing like that happened again, which I was pleased about. I'm going to read from the STST statement, in which you said the following: "We are demanding a full public inquiry into the Swansea demonstration, and particularly into the role played by the rugby vigilantes. This private army of rugby thugs was responsible for some of the most systemic and brutal mob violence ever seen on peaceful demonstrators in Britain. The introduction of the vigilantes into the protest arena must now call into question the whole future of the tour. Unless something is done now, someone may get killed." Was that hyperbole? No, at the time I really felt it. I was really worried about it. And I wanted a response from the police and those responsible for organising the rugby matches on the tour to behave in a more civil way. And so, accepting what you say entirely, that as we've been through, the STST had a principled objection to violence, the reality was, though, that the level of hostility that the STST was facing from rugby fans was such that it was evincing serious violence, which led actually to serious injury and could have resulted in someone being killed.
That was my fear. It didn't happen because policing from that point onward was better organised, and the rugby authorities didn't indulge in that kind of violent behaviour. The violence, I repeat, didn't come from the Stop the 70 tour protesters. They suffered violence because of their non-violent direct action tactics. They offered no resistance to being carried off the pitch. They didn't fight with the police. They didn't seek to pick a fight with the rugby stewards. If they'd been carried and unceremoniously dumped on the pavement outside the ground, as happened to me on several occasions at Twickenham, that would have been a good outcome all round, from a policing point of view, from a rugby organiser point of view, and from the protesters' point of view.
I'm going to move now back to the living room at 21A Gwendolyn Avenue, to the 5th of December 1969, and a meeting of the Stop the 70 Tour ad hoc committee that was held for the purposes of planning ahead for the Twickenham rugby match on the 20th of, due to occur on the 20th of December 1969. I'm going to start by reading your account of that meeting from your book. At planning meetings before the match, it was decided to stage a sit-down protest in front of the team's coach as it left for Twickenham, and a group was delegated to take responsibility for this. By this stage, we had established an inner group working behind the scenes on one or two special activities. This group came up with a plan to have someone chain himself to the team's coach, to waylay the coach in the London traffic, and to get a few demonstrators to handcuff themselves to the goalposts. This last was made possible when we suddenly acquired 4 special tickets, normally available only to rugby clubs, for the ringside seats in front of the surrounding fence and virtually on the touchline. 2 people were booked into the team's Park Lane Hotel the day before the match, and they spent a busy night on activities designed to delay the team, which included gumming up the players' bedroom door locks with a solidifying agent. That's a fair description, is it?
It's a fair description. It's what happened. All non-violent activity.
Absolutely. Can I come back to the inner group working behind the scenes? Can you distinguish this group, please, from the National Committee?
Yes. Apart from, I don't think that there were actually any National Committee members involved in that group, apart from me, and I was kept in close touch with its activities and helped plan many of them. And it was designed to do novel, imaginative, non-violent direct action tactics of precisely the kind that you just described in the pre-Christmas international between the Springboks and England.
And so how big was the inner group?
Less than 6, probably 4 or 5, maybe half a dozen, I would think, but certainly not bigger than that.
And what were the entrance qualifications?
People I trusted.
Did you know them all?
I did. There was not a single undercover officer on them involved.
And you, I don't want to make you paranoid, but how did you know that?
Because none of its activities were ever reported on in any of the documentation, the voluminous documentation I've been provided with kindly by the inquiry, and nor did anything that it planned ever leak out, as it were. And nor was it ever thwarted. So that's why I take that view. The only planned activity that it did instigate was to organize, pretend to organize a protest outside South African Airways offices in London's West End, and talk about that on our own telephone. And surprise, surprise, there were police outside the building, even though the people involved in allegedly organizing that protest, which was never due to happen, it was designed to expose that. So the people involved were very trustworthy. Ernest Rodker was one, a witness before the inquiry, and so was Jonathan Rosenhead.
And can you help me with the meeting on the 5th of December? Was that a meeting of the inner group, or was that a meeting of the National Committee, or some other composition of people?
Oh, you're asking me to be as precise as that.
If you can't remember, just say so.
I think from memory that was a meeting, a more informal meeting of the National Committee. I think that it was designed specifically to plan the Twickenham protest, is what I think. I don't have the book in front of me, so I can't confirm that, but that's what I recollect.
And coming back to the inner group, why was it felt necessary to have the inner group?
Because we suspected we might be infiltrated.
And was it also because of the risk of prosecution for conspiracy?
No, not really. It was more to do these imaginative acts of nonviolent direct action and make sure that they happened.
Thank you. So would now be a convenient moment for our morning break?
Certainly it would be. Lord Hain, we have to give the shorthand writers 15 minutes off in the middle of each session.
I'm very happy to comply with that. Thank you.
Good to be back in 15 minutes.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We will now take a break. May I remind those in the virtual hearing room to remember to join your breakout rooms, please. The time is now 11:15 a.m., so we shall reconvene at 11:30 a.m. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I will now hand over to the chairman to continue proceedings. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Barr.
Thank you, sir. Lord Hain, before the break, we were looking at the account in your book of the planning meeting for the December Twickenham match. We're now going to move to the second account that we have got of that match. So it's at tab 1 of the hard copy bundle. If we could have up, please, on the screen, UCPI 608656, please. Right. Lord Hain, this is the report of the undercover police officer Mike Ferguson, who we know by the Hain nominal HN135. It's dated the 9th of December 1969. It says that it's about a meeting of the Stop the 70 Tour ad hoc committee held on the 5th of December 1969 at 21A Gwendolyn Avenue, and it says that it was attended by 6 persons, among whom was Peter Hain, and then we have redacted for privacy reasons the other names. First of all, Lord Hain, you have been provided in confidence with the restricted cover name of Michael Ferguson. Has that helped you to recall that undercover police officer?
No, and I've not seen a photograph of him either to be able to identify him, though I did read an article by his daughter in The Guardian a few years ago, which gave me some inkling of memory of 50 years ago as to who he might have been.
Yeah.
From her description of him, you know, that he used to wear a coat and a scarf and drive a battered old van, and then I began to think who he might be.
Our policy with photographs is if we've got a photograph of the undercover officer as he or she appeared in their undercover identity, then we provide it, but we don't have one.
Presumably the Metropolitan Police do, though.
I think probably that's a matter to take up separately, but we don't have a photograph of him in his undercover police identity. Now, does the record of there being 6 people at this meeting sound right to you?
Yeah, about right. Though there are many other aspects of his report which we'll no doubt come to that I fundamentally dispute.
Indeed, and we'll go through it. Looking down the left-hand margin, we see box 500 stamped on the side of the page. That means it's gone to the security service, and we'll come back to that later on. For the moment, looking at paragraph 3, says the meeting was called to discuss basic tactics for the international match at Twickenham on the 20th of December 1969, and they agreed on 3 separate activities. 1, a mass demonstration outside the ground in which people from all walks are expected to participate. No particular incidents as yet planned for this demonstration, but there is a possibility that a sit-down will be encouraged somewhere along the route in an attempt to disrupt the flow of spectators or possibly the teams to the ground. Do you take issue with any of that?
Not from my recollection, no.
Paragraph 2, action within the ground itself. Hain is letting it be known generally that to hold a demonstration within the ground would be impracticable for several reasons: the security precautions, lack of tickets, and general crush of spectators. In fact, 300 5-shilling stand tickets have now been obtained, and it is felt that if a concentrated effort is made, a successful incident may be staged. And if we could Scroll down a bit, please. The target is the goalposts, where at least 2 demonstrators are to handcuff themselves to the posts in the vicinity of the crossbar. Whilst this was being discussed, Ernest Rodker rang to say that he had obtained 6 pairs of handcuffs. The exact mechanics of this plan have yet to be worked out. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And 3, it is generally understood that the Springboks will be using the Park Lane Hotel, Park Lane, W1, from about the 13th of December until after the international match. And there is general agreement that some action should be taken against Springboks themselves in an effort to prevent them from taking part in the, and if we could have that, scroll down onto the next page, please. Thank you. Match. To this end, privacy redaction is going to attempt to obtain employment into the Park Lane Hotel in order to obtain inside information as to their movements. At the same time, privacy redaction using a false name is to book accommodation at the hotel for at least the night of the Friday, the 19th of December. Do you agree with that?
Broadly, but if the implication is that action against the Springboks would be to somehow attack them as individuals, then no, that was definitely not the intention, as long as that gloss is not interpreted from this report. The things we were intending were to do exactly what we described before the break in respect of the team's bus and in a coach, and in terms of gumming up the door locks of the players' bedrooms.
Understood. Going back to subparagraph 2, when a distinction was made between what you were saying publicly about action within the grounds and what you were doing privately to prepare for people to handcuff themselves to the goalposts. Is that an example of deliberate misinformation in order to maximize the surprise value of your tactics?
It's an example of precisely the kind of non-violent direct action that we were planning, to run onto the pitch and chain yourself to the goalposts. There was no misinformation. The anti-apartheid movement, with the support of the Stop the 72 campaign, was organizing a public demonstration outside. We were not intending a demonstration inside in the sense of a massive gathering of people. We're intending to try and get on the pitch and stop the match.
But you were giving the impression that it was all going to happen outside, where in fact you were planning a stunt for the inside.
I don't think that was ever, people knew all along that that was our intention to get inside. I never said in a misleading way we were only going to organize outside. We did announce, and the anti-apartheid movement organized a big peaceful rally outside. That was a declared public event. We didn't pre-announce our non-violent direct tactics inside the ground, or they wouldn't have happened, would they?
Well, exactly.
But we were not misleading people. I was not lying about the situation. I couldn't have been publicly more clear about our attempt to stop the matches if we got a chance.
Let's move now, please, Lord Hain, to what actually happened. It's right, isn't it, that at the hotel, some of the players' door locks were glued?
Yes.
It's right, isn't it, that an activist got onto the Springboks coach and chained himself to the steering wheel?
Yes, he persuaded the driver to go and talk to the management in the hotel. He was dressed in a suit, which was untypical for us at the time, and the driver accepted his credentials, went into the hotel, and he took his place and drove the coach away and chained himself to the steering wheel, as was intended.
And found it rather difficult to drive a coach whilst chained to the steering wheel, to the point where he had a minor road traffic accident.
Yes, and also he was grappled with by some of the Springbok players who were on the coach already, not the entire team, and they kind of collectively forced the coach to slew into the side and effectively have a mini crash.
And he was assaulted, wasn't he, the activist?
Yeah, he was quite badly assaulted.
You've mentioned the large demonstration outside the ground that was organised by the anti-apartheid movement. Within the ground, your two colleagues did make a dash for the goalposts. One made it, the other didn't.
No, the other was rugby tackled to the ground by a police officer. So unfortunately, never did make it, but one of them did.
Thank you. Can we move now to Bristol on New Year's Eve, 1969? And this is a matter which you have, I think, dealt with in your witness statement, but you also deal with it in your book at page 143. And the way you deal with it in your book is to say the next match at Bristol on New Year's Eve was interrupted for nearly 10 minutes after a demonstrator ran onto the pitch and scattered tacks. A demonstration of over 500 had marched to the ground and spectators were leafleted. In the early hours of that morning, demonstrators rigged up 2 crow scarers and a smoke flare in the corridor outside the team's bedrooms with the idea of keeping the Springboks awake. Their plan was thwarted when the hotel manager discovered the device, but the hotel's fire alarm was set off. First of all, as best as you can recall, is that factually accurate?
Yes, but I want to explain because it's pertinent to something that I think it was Mike Ferguson, the undercover officer, infiltrating the Stop the 72 campaign. He specifically says in one of the reports, the many reports with which the inquiry supplied me, that we were planning to sprinkle tin tacks. The only example of tin tacks being spread during any of the matches was at this Bristol incident, but by a teacher, I think his name was Michael Jordan, who I'd never met. And it was an entirely spontaneous event, as he subsequently explained. And he did it as a one-off thing. I was expressly opposed always to tactics like that because of, I love the game of rugby like I do cricket, and rugby players roll on the ground a lot. And if they'd encountered tin tacks, they would have been badly injured. So this was something I deplored and opposed, and it was a one-off event that isn't actually explained in that passage. But I think it was Mike Ferguson in subsequent documentation that we may or may not be discussing, alleged that it was planned to do this at a subsequent match by the Stop the 72 demonstrators at Twickenham, and that was expressly a lie, like a lot of his other claims were lies and exaggerations.
It's a feature, isn't it, of a group which is as loosely organised as the STST was, that whatever the central line or central principle is, you cannot control precisely what everybody does. On the contrary, you're encouraging them to go away, make their own plans, and to disrupt the matches using their local knowledge in their own way. Is that fair?
I explained, I think, at the outset, there was no central command and structure to the Stop the 72 campaign. There was a leadership, but there were no members who could be disciplined or ordered about, and people were doing their own thing. But that was not part of a plan, in the sense that I was not encouraging people to be violent, as it were, adopting one public posture and privately giving a nod and a wink to people, for example, to sprinkle tin tacks. On the contrary, I was publicly always disavowing such tactics if they occurred, and very few did. That was an isolated case. Nothing else like that happened in the tour, and there was very little instances of planned violence that I knew of. I don't remember any instance of a planned violent act, although obviously this tin tax one could have led to that. But if you're making the point that this was a massive movement and there were lots of people organizing spontaneously, yes, there were. But does that justify Mike Ferguson deploying special, extraordinary police resources to take part in meetings in my living room, or my parents' living room, and in young Liberal meetings? Another undercover officer going by the name of Mike Scott, who I again don't recognize. One of my points that we may or may not come to about the work of undercover officers during the Stop the 72 campaign is, why were they not targeting the agents of apartheid, bombing and killing and acting illegally and violently in London at the time? Why were they not concentrating Metropolitan Police resources on drug traffickers and criminals and organized crime? Why were they diverting precious and limited resources into meetings in my living room, some of which were half a dozen people of a Putney Young Liberal meeting, 3 of whom were members of my family, and one of whom on one occasion was a representative of the Putney Society, which is a very, very respectable organization in part of the Putney civil society, briefing us about what was happening to the greenery around Putney. I mean, this was a completely disproportionate waste of police resources. And it was on the wrong side of history, because the Mike Fergusons and the Mike Scotts were actually, what they should have been doing was helping bring down the apartheid system and deploying British security and policing resources to track down apartheid agents acting illegally in London, instead of which they were spying on us.
Thank you. I'm going to move now into 1970 and to Dublin, because the Springboks went to Dublin, and you cover this at page 144 of your book. I'm reading from towards the bottom of the page. From the moment the team arrived at Dublin Airport, they were assailed with protests which continued wherever they went, hotels and training sessions included. There were petitions and bomb scares, conventional pickets and militant sit-downs. And at the international match on Saturday, the 12th of January, came the biggest and best demonstration of the whole tour. 10,000 people marched on the Lansdowne Road ground, led by Bernadette Devlin MP and prominent Irish public figures. The march was the largest public assembly in Dublin since the Troubles of 50 years back. There were various attempts to get into the ground, and at one stage it was touch and go whether a gate would fall under the weight of the demonstration, letting through the whole mass. Inside the ground, there were only sporadic outbursts of opposition, and the match went unhindered. But this hardly surprising. The pitch was encircled by barbed wire with hundreds of policemen stationed behind it. First of all, is that a fair summary of what happened?
I think so. I thought it was very appropriate to be surrounded by barbed wire, because that symbolized the concentration camp conditions into which these matches were played. Apartheid rugby matches were being played with all the resources of the state, whether in Britain or in that case Ireland, deployed to protect them.
There are 2 points I want to draw out from that description. The first is the reference to bomb scares. Was that, or was that not, something that the National Committee would have condoned?
No, we would have never even considered it. Not only would we not have condoned it, we would have expressly condemned anything like that. I don't know whether that happened in the context of, because I was not involved in that demonstration, nor did I organize it. It was in Ireland. But I don't know whether that bomb scare was part of the escalating atmosphere of terrorism on the island of Ireland, which by then had begun. And that may have, somebody may have phoned a telephone warning. For all I know, I simply reported in my book, which you very fairly read out, what I understand happened.
And the other bit I want to pick up on is the weight of the demonstration almost bringing the gate down, or a concern about the weight of the demonstration bringing the gate down. That suggests a weight of numbers of people that would give rise to policing concerns. And we know what happened at Hillsborough in very different circumstances, but large numbers of people do generate policing issues, don't they?
Yes, I totally understand that. I was reporting what I understood to be happening accurately to the best of my ability at the time, and it's recorded in the book. It was, I think, the biggest demonstration of the entire tour, organised by the Irish anti-apartheid movement, led by two South African exiles, Kader Asmal, who subsequently became a minister in Nelson Mandela's government, and his wife, Louise Asmal.
Thank you. I'm going to move now back to Great Britain, and in particular to Worcester and the outfield on the 7th of January, where you tell us in para 48 of your witness statement that weed killer was applied to the outfield. Is that right?
Was that the 7th of January, did you say?
I think so.
I think it's later than that.
Is it?
Yes. Yes, that was certainly, I think I reported that. I think it was actually late. I think it was more like the 20th, but
I got that from your book. I'm reading page 165, where it reads, then on the 7th of January came the news that the cricket world must have been expecting in one form or another. Demonstrators had applied weed killer to the outfield of the Worcester ground, quote, as a warning of things to come.
Ah, right, yes. Well, if it was in my book, it must have been correct, Mr. Barr.
Thank you. It may be that it was a precursor to what I'm moving on to next, which is the 19th of January, when
That's what I thought you were talking about, yes.
The 14 out of the 17 cricket clubs were raided, and that involved the painting of slogans, in one case, the digging up of part of the pitch, and in another case, some weed killer being applied. Is that a fair summary of what happened?
Yes.
Having been through these events, and we haven't quite finished because we've got the last match at Twickenham coming up, but viewed from a policing perspective, faced with these novel, rather effective tactics, with the violence that had occurred and with large crowds, bomb scares in Dublin, would you accept that someone in charge of the policing of public order at these matches would have wanted to have as much intelligence as possible about the intentions of the STST?
Well, they knew what our intentions were because we stated it publicly.
Well, you know what I'm really driving at is about the behind-the-scenes plans for the non.
Well, I know what you're trying to insinuate, but when I don't want to misrepresent you, but our plans were quite public. We wanted to disrupt the tour by non-violent direct action. Bomb scares and weed killer and digging up cricket pitches and certainly sprinkling tin tacks were no part of those plans. And indeed, when that happened, I condemned it, as you will know, publicly, and is recorded in my book. So, it's not as if the Stop the 70 tour was a secret conspiratorial organization that nobody knew anything about, a cell-like structure, like a paramilitary organization or of that ilk. We were transparently public, some might say unwisely honest about what our intentions were, which was to stop the tour by non-violent direct action. And, and that leads me to where I think you're taking me. Why was an undercover officer in virtually every meeting that I attended when they could have found out what I was planning to do by what I'd publicly stated, which is to try and stop the matches by non-violent action?
Would it be fair to say they would have known your broad intent, that, as we went through earlier, had been made abundantly clear? They would have known the sort of tactics that the STST was going to use. They'd had plenty of experience of that, and you'd made it abundantly clear. But what they did not have was precise information about who was going to do what when.
No, that's fair enough. And if their intention was to support the apartheid Springbok tour and protect it going ahead, as seems to be the case, then no doubt they were carrying out their duties. But again, I come back to why were they doing that rather than targeting people undertaking violent, illegal murders and bombings in London on behalf of the South African state?
I see. Thank you. I'm going to move finally now to the last match, the Twickenham match, 31st of January 1970, between Springboks and the Barbarians. I'm going to start by reading your account. It starts at the bottom of page 146 and runs to the top of page 147. Soon after the start, the demonstrators began throwing the die onto the pitch. Immediately, fighting broke out on the terraces as plainclothes detectives, determined no doubt to uphold the tough reputation the police had established at the Twickenham matches, set upon the die throwers. For good measure, orange and grey smoke bombs were also tossed, billowing onto the field, and a constant barrage of chanting was kept up. We were determined to give the Springboks, as I had put it in a press interview, a rousing send-off. But although there were one or two minor interruptions, the game went on. On its own, the demonstration would have provided a spectacular finish to the tour, but there was still more in store for the Springboks before they finally and wearily left for home. Protesters shouted and chanted at the reception after the match. In the evening, STST held a party which was geared towards one final project, an attempt to talk to the team members. One of our girls' supporters had deliberately struck up a friendship with a Springbok player at the team's Bristol hotel a month before. After the groundwork had been prepared, the aim was to get him and some of his colleagues to our party with her. Everything went smoothly, and she arranged to fetch him later that night after the reception. But when she arrived at the hotel, her man was completely drunk. And so STST's Matahari came back alone, thwarted by beer.
Yes, that's accurate. If I may just clarify on the dye, the intention was it was a form of dye that if it got damp, it went black. And although it was white dye carried in transparency in plastic packets, it's to go back, rolled, if the Springboks rolled on the turf in a maul or a ruck, their legs would then go black and their arms. So the idea was to paint them black and send them back to make a kind of a graphic sort of portrayal of the absurdities of apartheid in sport. And the smoke flares were designed, they were not in any sense threatening to anybody. They were designed to create the kind of visual impact of a rugby match under siege, which is what it was. By that stage, I should add, it was much more difficult to run onto the pitch because the policing of the stadio around the barriers between spectators and the pitch was such that it was very difficult to climb over and get onto the pitch without being nabbed, as I found myself.
I see. Righto, I would like to move now to the aftermath of that, and in particular, there was some comment in the True Spies programme about this. This is in the bundle. It's at tab 71, sir, of the hard copy, and the page that we want up on the screen, please, is UCPI 5031845. And if you've got the copy with a lot of pages, please could we have page 12 up, please? And the bottom half of that page, please. Can we just go over the page, please? Yeah, that's it. Lovely. Thank you. Now, Lord Hain, this is a transcript from the True Spies programme, and you will see that you are recorded as saying, this is a campaign against the cricket tour and the rugby tour and apartheid in sport in general. Our organising tactic will be one of non-violent direct action, that is, run onto the pitch and disrupt matches. Then we get an former undercover police officer using the pseudonym Dan. I remember meeting with a senior officer at Scotland Yard, and I said there would be an awful lot of blood spilled on the streets of London. And that wasn't the view that was held in some circles at that time within the police service. And can we take it, Lord Hain, after everything you've told us this morning, that was most certainly not your view either?
Well, it was not only not my view, it was not factually correct. There's another example of a sort of self-promoting exaggeration by the undercover officers involved in the Stop the 70 tour campaign, that they sometimes told the truth, but often they told lies, including about the Twickenham match that we've just discussed, that we were going to spread tin tacks on the pitch, which was never anybody's intention and didn't happen. So I think their intention was really to self-promote themselves, really, by exaggerating the threat and the risk of violence. And that quote is an example about blood spilt on the streets of London, so that they became so important, or perceived as so important to their superiors in the Metropolitan Police, that they had to be kept going deeper and deeper and continuing to make all sorts of devious and completely factually incorrect allegations about what was intended. It was, as it were, to reinforce their own undercover policing role, when they should have been, as a risk of boring everybody, they should have been concentrating their resources on violent, illegal acts carried out by the apartheid state in London at the time. They should have been concentrating Metropolitan Police resources on tackling serious organised criminality and terrorism, because those were the early days of the IRA's bombing campaign in London.
Can we go over the page, please? And I'm going to pick up, I'm looking for the passage that begins in general, which is, I think, just a little bit higher up. Thank you. Sorry, it's at the bottom of this page on the copy we're using. In general, the Hairy's aim was to rise within an organisation, but not to end up running it. In the case of the Stop the 70 tour, the Hairy, who got very close to the top, was called Mike. Hairy's had handlers, and Mike's handler was Wilf. And if we could go over the page now, please. Mike worked his way into the organisation by his, shall I say, his enthusiasm, his dedication, his skill, his intelligence, worked his way up to being Peter Hain's number 2. I don't think Peter Hain ever realised that he had a police officer as his number 2. And then you are recorded being asked, were you aware of the attentions of Special Branch and MI5? I was not directly aware, in the sense that somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, we're keeping a watch on you, but we had good reason to believe that this was happening, and a number of events occurred during the Stop the Tour campaign which confirm that. I know you've answered this before in your witness statement, but I'm going to ask it you again after everything we've been through this morning. Does it remain your recollection that you did not have a number 2?
Yes, I didn't have a number 2, so that's another, false statement by the undercover officer involved, and there was no number 2. There were a number of senior people around me, and he wasn't one of them, certainly, but there was no number 2. And if I may say so, this underlines my point that I don't think you can rely on Mike Ferguson's reports of the Stop the 70 tour campaign, because his reports to his seniors were so factually incorrect and so self-promotingly exaggerated and sometimes straight lies, that I think he was completely unreliable.
Can we scroll down a little bit, please, so that we have the paragraph which is penultimate at the moment near the top of the page? The commentator says, the Hairy's finest hour came at the climax of the tour during the match between the Springboks and the Barbarians at Twickenham. Wilf, the intention was for the demonstrators just prior to half-time to throw flares, smoke bombs and metal tacks onto the pitch. Mike passed that information on. It was passed on to the uniform, and at the appointed time, officers were there with sand buckets and metal magnets, and although they threw as many as they could onto the pitch, they were snuffed out, taken away, and the players didn't know that it had taken place, and when they came out after half-time, the game carried on. I think this is, you've referred to this already, and you've pointed out that tacks were not used at Twickenham at that match.
They were not used, and this is a very clear example of a lie by Mike, in quotes. A straight lie. We didn't intend to spread tin tacks, and I've explained why not, because they'd have injured the players. There were no tin tacks spread. There were no reports of tin tacks being perhaps intercepted, and there were certainly no reports of any tin tacks anywhere around that match in Twickenham. If there had been, they would have created headlines, as I'm sure you will understand. They'd have represented a very serious development in the whole anti-apartheid campaign around that tour. But there weren't any such reports because there were no such tin tacks.
Lord Hain, this is not Mike speaking, it's Wilf speaking, and it's Wilf speaking 30 years after the event. Although, as you suggest, a lie might be one explanation, might some confusion 30 years later be another one?
Some confusion would be a very charitable description of it, if I may say so, Mr. Barr, because it was typical of the behavior of undercover officers, as I've seen in the documentation provided to me by the inquiry, that they very rarely told the truth about what was going on. I knew what was going on and I knew what was not going on. And that was certainly not going on. So whether it's, exaggerated in hindsight, or whether it was reported at the time, and I don't know, but it was a lie.
Can we pick up at the bottom of the page? Later on at a meeting, Peter Hain felt that there quite rightly was a spy in their midst. And there was one poor devil that Mike Ferguson looked down the room and said, I think it's him. And he got thrown out. And Ferguson survived, bless him. Can we go over the page, please? And you are recorded as saying, well, quite possibly. The commentator I'll stop there. You say quite possibly at that stage. Yeah. I think now you don't have any recollection of that at all. Is that right?
Yes, I don't quite know how that's come out. They must have put the program together, I don't mean in a malevolent way, but somehow out of context, because I cannot recall that incident at all. None of the people who are involved can recall that incident at all, those that are still alive. And I think it was manufactured, frankly, again to, I don't know, in some theatrical way. But what possibly could have caused some confusion in terms of the program that we're seeing the transcript from is that we were concerned about infiltrators, and we did get rid of somebody who, and I think I refer to this in my statement, from claiming to be from the Surrey anti-apartheid movement and claiming to be a member of the Communist Party, that we were very suspicious of. And so we stopped him coming. to meetings. But obviously, the Mike Ferguson, who's was playing this UCO role, who continued to be at the meetings, clearly, because he's reporting some aspects of them as happening. He was still there, but I don't remember that dramatic incident of anybody being thrown out of a meeting because a finger had been pointed at him. So that's another example of something that was just false.
Okay, now, the reason I hesitated earlier is there's a difference between the transcript I've got and the transcript you've got on the screen. Can we just go up further, please? Yes, that's a bit we want. Sorry, now we had, there's a bit of the transcript that we missed out there. We picked up at bless him, which I think you can see halfway down the screen. The interviewer, do you recall that? Then you say, I do recall that, yes. Interviewer, just tell us about that. What did you do? Did you suspect the spy? And then you say, there was lots of suspicions at the time, but I just took the view that what we were doing was correct, and I wasn't going to be deflected by fringe sort of pressures of that kind. Then interviewer, but you got the wrong spy. And then back to the bit of the transcript we had up before where you say quite possibly yes. You've explained that you don't have a recollection now of that happening, but you do seem, when interviewed for the True Spies program, to have said at that stage that you did recall it.
Well, I think to be fair, Mr. Barr, I think since I don't recall it, and I'm simply telling you that honestly, and nobody still alive at the time recalls it either, I think if you read a fair reading of that transcript, I'm saying, well, quite possibly. And then there were a lot of, had a lot of suspicions at the time. And I think, though it's a while ago, during the program, I think it was put together, and I'm not saying malevolently, but I do not at any time say in that transcript, yes, that guy was, that description by the undercover officer was absolutely correct. I don't say that, do I?
I think what you say is in relation to the deflected accusation. You are recorded as saying, I do recall that, yes. My question to you is, do you think that in the early noughties, when you were interviewed, you might then still have had a recollection of that happening, even if it is one which is now faded away?
No, because we were worried about a number of people, and some of those worries were proved to be wrong. I mean, when there's a certain paranoia develops if you are concerned about being infiltrated. And that was what I was trying to convey. I'm trying to read the transcript as fairly and honestly as I can, but for the life of me, Mr. Barr, I cannot recall that incident ever happening. And since he also claims to be number two and I didn't have a number two, I rather doubt the provenance or the accuracy or the veracity of that particular incident. But I do say quite possibly things like that happened, but certainly not that incident as it is explained in those very direct terms.
Thank you. Could we take that down now, please? And could we have up in its place UCPI 608660? So that's at tab 4 of the hard copy bundle. Now, Lord Hain, this is a report on the STST's annual general meeting, which was held on the 7th of March 1970. It's again a report of Mike Ferguson's, and there are a couple of things that I want to pick up in this report with you. The first is some references to violence. If we could go to page 2, please, and look at paragraph 5. And paragraph 5 reads, Michael Brearley, a Northern University lecturer and a Middlesex cricketer, gives a well-reasoned speech in which he warned delegates against the use of violence for violence sake in their demonstrations. He spoke for the moderates within STST, who are against all forms of violence. Unfortunately, neither Brearley nor any of the other speakers could satisfactorily define violence, which complicated the arguments for and against it. And if holding that in mind, we could go to paragraph 8 on the next page, please. And I'm interested in the bottom of paragraph 8, where it reads, despite this difference, it was stressed that STST was not a monolithic organization, and its avowed policy was one of non-violent militant direct action. If individuals or individual groups felt that violence was called for, then they must be final judges of what action was appropriate. This concluded the morning session. So from those two passages, we see Mike Ferguson doing two things. He's first of all portraying the STST as a group within which there were two schools of thought on violence, one firmly against violence and one a little more tolerant of it. Does that fairly reflect the realities of the STST?
I don't think so. First of all, Mike Brearley, of course, subsequently was the England cricket captain, and you alone, like John Taylor, the Welsh rugby international during the rugby tour campaign, was the only rugby international to speak up on our side and against the tour. So Mike Brearley was the only cricketer to do so. And it was very courageous of him to come to our conference in March 1970, because we're a very controversial organization and there was a lot of hostility to us and our tactics in seeking to stop that cricket tour. And he was making it very clear, and I cheered him on at the time, and certainly would do so now again, that he did not support violence, because a lot of our critics try to portray us as unlawful and violent when we were neither, and especially we were committed to non-violence, which is actually referred to in paragraph 8. But what the undercover officer's trying to portray there is that there was a double side to the Stop the 70 tour campaign. There was the open advocacy, which I explained, of non-violent direct action, and then there were elements who were committed to violence. I don't think that's true at all. I don't think anybody wanted to hurt any of the Springboks. Nobody wanted to injure them during a rugby match. I don't think anybody wanted to commit violence of that kind. There might or might not have been groups seeking to get in on the act, and there were, but then they could have been targeted by the police if the police were concerned about them. There's a reference in one of the undercover officer reports, from my recollection in my large bundle, to anarchists advocating violence. Well, there were no doubt a few anarchists around who were doing that, but they were not part of the Stop the 70 tour movement, and nor would Mike Ferguson attending meetings in my parents' living room have gained any intelligence which might have assisted the police to stop them doing what they might or might not have intended.
The second thing that comes out of those paragraphs is that at least one speaker appears to have expressed the view that ultimately whether violence was called for was a matter for an individual to decide. Might it have been that a speaker at that conference expressed that view?
I don't recall that. I honestly do not recall that, and it would have surprised me. Look, there were a variety of people, a great spectrum of people at that conference, from vicars to young communists. I don't recall anybody advocating violence at all, or anybody saying, well, look, it's a matter for you if you want to do that. Our general view was to try and bring people of whatever opinion on the progressive and left side and liberal side of politics who backed the Stop the 70 tour campaign to rally around the non-violent direct action objectives, which is what people did.
The technician has very efficiently taken that document down, but unfortunately I hadn't finished with it. Could we have UCPI 608-660 back, please? Just two more points. If we go up to the paragraph above, please. I'm interested in the end of this paragraph, which reads, the support which has been gained in such a short time should not be allowed to dissipate at the end of the Springboks tour. From attacking apartheid in sport, they must move into the wider field of racism, both in South Africa and in this country. And finally, the capitalist system which nurtured it. Now, this is recorded as you speaking, and you've addressed it in your witness statement, and you've made abundantly clear that you were not a communist at any time. But I am interested, please, in why it was that you were using the word capitalist system in this context. Could you explain that, please?
Yes, I'm very happy to, because it was in this instance, the British capitalist system that was trading with the apartheid regime, that was sending arms to the apartheid regime, enabling them to exterminate anti-apartheid activists in Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, terrorizing black townships and attacking African National Congress freedom fighters operating in frontline states in sub-Saharan Africa. So actually what was happening was the capitalist system of the kind that was operating in Britain at the time was arming the most brutal racist system that the world has ever known. That was the point that I was making, and that we as an economic system in Britain, and the same was true of America and most of Europe, with the exception to their great credit of the Scandinavian countries, were trading with the apartheid regime and giving it all the wealth that it needed to continue to monopolize control and power and suppress the Black African majority. That was what I was saying. I mean, it's not the 70 Tour campaign was not some sort of revolutionary organization. It was a disarmingly non-violent, direct action committed anti-apartheid movement.
I mean, there are two ways of really expressing the concerns that you've just articulated. One would be to say that you wanted finally to attack the countries and the companies which trade with the apartheid regime. The other is to describe it through a more theoretical prism and talk about the capitalist system. Now, did you refer to it as capitalist because it might play to some of the elements in the broad church that you were preaching to on that occasion?
No, I referred to it for the reason I've explained. But let me be frank with you and with Sir John. I'm a democratic socialist. I think that capitalism run in its more extreme way is designed to create a rich elite at the top and great impoverishment down below, instead of to spread wealth and ownership more widely and to allow people to participate more equitably in the running of their economy. So I want a fairer, more just economic system, and I make no bones about that. I was a socialist at the time I was in the Young Liberals, and I remain one. And if that's the discussion we want to have, I'm very happy to have it. But the point I was making at the time was that the British capitalist system was more interested in profits and in trade than in decency and human rights and justice and non-racism, because actually its trade and its supplying of arms was perpetuating apartheid, entrenching it, and strengthening it.
Thank you, that's very clear. Could we move in this document, please, over the page to paragraph 12? Says, the conference was ended by a short address from Peter Hain, in which he thanked all those present for their assistance over the past months and urged them to even greater activity during the forthcoming weeks. He warned, however, that they must be aware of infiltrators without becoming neurotic, as the STST was undoubtedly of great interest to the authorities and special branch. Unknown faces and strange volunteers should be treated with suspicion. The conference was then concluded. I mean, you've already explained in the context of the True Spies transcript some elements of the security concerns that you had, but this type of record of how you spoke at meetings this is not the only example. Is it fair to say that you preach the message of security consciousness to the STST and indeed some of the other non-violent direct action groups you were involved in?
Yes, for one very good reason, apart from others, Mr. Barr, and that is that the South African security services were infiltrating us. It was a South African agent, to my knowledge, that recorded the annual general meeting of the anti-apartheid movement in October 1969, to which we referred earlier in this session. And they were trying to disrupt the Stop the 70 Tour campaign, working in collaboration with British intelligence organizations and working in collaboration, obviously, with the South African security services were. So we were very concerned about the apartheid state, particularly infiltrating us. And since the apartheid state security services were working hand in glove with the British security services at the time, presumably also including the special branch and no doubt undercover officers such as Mike Ferguson and Mike Scott, who are a figure in this part of the inquiry. We were concerned about that as well, because the South African security services had been responsible for a great deal of illegal, violent activity and attacks on anti-apartheid activists, including, as I said earlier, the headquarters of the anti-apartheid movement and the headquarters in London of the African National Congress. Yeah, we were concerned about infiltration, there's no question about it, but it was that as well that we were concerned about.
Thank you. Could we take that document down now, please? And could we have UCPI 5014399 up next? That's tab 5 in your bundle, sir. This is the 7th of April, 1970. The cricket tour at that stage had not quite being cancelled. Your campaign had a little longer to run. And this is a report on the London Regional Conference of the STST held in St Pancras Town Hall on the 5th of April. Can we go please to paragraph 5, first of all? Paragraph 5, it was generally agreed that the organisation of STST was too small in that it did not comprehensively, if we go over the page, thank you, cover London. Delegates were urged to set up local groups as soon as possible and to commence fundraising and political activities. The formation of these groups should be given the widest publicity in an endeavour to bring the aims of the campaign to the man in the street. This would best be achieved by distributing leaflets in the most appropriate areas. And I've picked this paragraph, Lord Hain, as a hook to hang at this point on. It's right, isn't it, that your organisation was expanding right up to the end of the campaign and the cancellation of the cricket tour?
Yes, it was, and I don't see what's wrong with that. Trying to form more groups in different local communities to achieve our objective of stopping the 1970 racist cricket tour. I'm not sure what could be seen as being objectionable about that.
I'm not suggesting there's anything objectionable about it at all.
Good.
What it did leave you, though, was a nice problem to have, which is what do you do with all these committed activists who've been mobilised after the cricket tour has ended? Is it right that the answer to that was to keep them mobilized on a different campaign, and that's how we get into the campaigns against racialism.
Yes, in part, though I specifically urged Stop the 70 Tour activists, not all of whom were members of the anti-apartheid movement, which is the largest movement anywhere in the world here in Britain, to join the anti-apartheid movement and get involved in its wider activities. And from my recollection, its membership trebled as a result of the Stop the 70 Tour campaign and partly during it. So that was what I wanted to see. I wanted to see the sports campaign spread more generally into the wider anti-apartheid struggle against economic links, against arming South Africa, for freeing Nelson Mandela and imposing sanctions. So yes, setting up the Action Committee Against Racism was part of it, but there was a very small part of it, to be frank. The wider, the momentum was really carried on into the anti-apartheid movement itself.
And just to complete the story of the STST, demonstrations were organized for the 2nd of May 1970 and went ahead outside cricket grounds. And those were they largely of a conventional nature?
They were. There was no match to disrupt because it hadn't happened, but it was a sign of mobilizing activity to campaign against the tour and making our argument.
And if we can have one final document up in relation to the STST, it's UCPI 608606. It's tab 9 of your bundle, sir. And paragraph 3, please. Thank you. Not an easy document to read, but towards the bottom of paragraph 3, this is a meeting of the National STST Committee, again, at 21A Gwendolyn Avenue. And the report reads, there could be no doubt that the next 2 weeks would be crucial as far as getting the tour cancelled was concerned, and the trump cards which STST had to play in connection with the Commonwealth Games and the racial disorder which would occur in the event of the tour taking place. Was racial disorder one of your trump cards, Lord Hain?
No, of course not. But that's a rather slanted description of what was happening and a biased, if I may say so, presentation of reality. If you remember from reading my book, Frank Cousins, the chair, I think it was, of the Community Relations Commission, which was dedicated to improving race relations in Britain, had called for the tour to be cancelled because he was concerned about the interaction of apartheid, pro-apartheid activity and pro-tour activity with racist groups such as the National Front and Nazi groups around them, such as the National Front, attacking the Black community. And Jeff Crawford, for example, who's referred to in some of these documents, the leader of the West Indian Standing Conference and a keen cricket fan himself, a British Caribbean citizen, he joined the Stop the 70 Tour committee and linked our two organizations together because he was concerned that racist elements in Britain were attacking the Black community as they were attacking the anti-apartheid movement. So there was a concern about race relations, yes, indeed, but it was not that the Stop the 70 Tour campaign's activities had stirred up racial disorder. It was that pro-apartheid racist organizations were actually attacking us as an organization, demonstrating against us and also promoting their racist beliefs. And on the Commonwealth Games at that stage in proceedings was on the point of collapse because African countries had withdrawn. The Games were due to be staged in Edinburgh in July 1970 and would have taken place the same time as the cricket tour, had it gone ahead, the Commonwealth Games faced a progressive boycott in protest against the cricket tour happening. So African countries withdrew initially, South Asian countries, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka withdrew, Caribbean countries withdrew. So you'd have had an all-white Commonwealth Games running alongside an all-white racist South African cricket tour. And that was a big factor. And to that extent, even though the wording is, I would take issue with, it is the case that the concern about race relations, for the reasons I've explained, and the concerns about the future of the Commonwealth Games, for the reasons I've explained, had escalated the issue of stopping the 70 cricket tour from an idea in the hands of a small number of us a year previously to basically an international political confrontation, as well as a concern about domestic racial harmony in Britain.
Thank you. And as we all know, the next thing that happens is the tour is cancelled. Just to ask a hypothetical question, if it had not been, is it fair to say that the SGST would have continued with its determined attempts to disrupt the matches?
Oh, yes, no question about that. We had all sorts of plans. For example, the first match, which I think we called a demonstration, which we called D-Day for the 6th of June, Demo Day, which 100,000 were expected in London. And in addition, there were all sorts of novel tactics planned for cricket matches. We discovered an underground, disused underground tunnel of, I think, the Bakerloo line, and an air vent coming up from it into Lord's Cricket Ground, actually within the ground, and planned to infiltrate hundreds and potentially thousands of demonstrators through that avenue and invade the pitch. There was lots of things going on like that. People had bought mirrors to flash in the batsmen's eyes. Some were planning to fly model aircraft off their aunt's flat overlooking Lords and things like that. So there's a great deal of activity going on indeed.
And so from your point of view, there was the certainty of disruption, but might there also have been the risk of evincing the sort of violent reaction that we saw at Swansea?
Well, if the stewarding of the cricket matches and the behaviour of the police had been replicated from Swansea, undoubtedly there would have been that danger, which is why I was anxious that that didn't happen. And why, for all sorts of reasons, I was so pleased when we stopped the tour, because we were one of the very few protest movements using non-violent direct action to have ever achieved our objectives completely. And it was an enormous boost for the anti-apartheid movement. I mean, I think it's important to say, without taking liberties with your time in this inquiry, Sir John, that at that period, the resistance to apartheid inside South Africa had been closed down. The entire leadership of the African National Congress was with Robben Island, was on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela. Activists like my parents had been driven into exile. Others had been tortured, imprisoned, arrested, attacked. The entire resistance had been suppressed. So this campaign came at a time and achieved a victory, which was very, very important for the momentum of the international anti-apartheid movement. So I was thrilled when the tour was cancelled, but I was also relieved because I didn't look forward to the confrontations that would have undoubtedly have occurred.
We can move now from the SGST to the Young Liberals. As you've explained, the Young Liberals did use NVDA, and that throws up an interesting curiosity, doesn't it? And that is that we have the youth wing of a mainstream political party which is prepared to commit minor criminal offences to advance its aim.
Like what criminal offence? Could you be specific?
Well, there may be things like minor criminal damage, or there might be minor public order offences, that sort of thing.
You mean like occurred at the Sarah Everard demonstration in Clapham Common? Would you describe that as a minor?
I'm afraid I have to ask you the questions, and
I'm just trying to understand the meaning of your question.
I'm trying to gauge from you whether you accept that what was going on was that the youth wing of the Liberal Party in the early 1970s did involve people who were prepared to commit non-violent offences at the very bottom end of the scale of offending.
Well, in that sense, if you're talking about me, because I was chair of the Stop the 72 campaign, and I became a very prominent young Liberal as a result. And I've explained my philosophy on that, and I've explained how if I was committing offences at the time of the minor kind that you're describing, criminal offences, presumably I would have been apprehended and arrested, and I wasn't.
Well, I think you, things like sitting down on a zebra crossing, and I think at one point you were taken to.
Yeah, that was a year later in 1971. Indeed, yes.
That's the sort of thing I'm talking about.
Okay, well, I plead guilty to that because I did.
And again, all because of driven by a passion in the cause. And
yes, and in a long line of non-violent direct action, some of it civil disobedience, if you like, that has achieved the progress that this country has seen, whether on votes for women or votes for everybody, or rights for trade unionists, or in this case, advancing the anti-racist cause.
And really the point I was making was that this is pretty unusual for a mainstream political party, isn't it?
It is, and it did cause a lot of tension within the Liberal Party, though I don't think that that's the focus of this inquiry, Sir John.
No, it isn't. Now, what I want to put to you now is a paradox. The paradox is that we know that the young Liberals were committing some minor criminal offences in the course of non-violent direct action. We've got quite a lot of reports in the bundle about the meetings that were being reported by HN 298. I'm going to, if you want me to turn in any of these up, I will do, but I'm just going to summarize the sort of topics that were being discussed. And then I'm going to take you to one report in particular. We've got at tab 19, a meeting on the 6th of January 1972, discussing the problems of drugs and a possible sit-in at local council chambers. We've got at tab 20, a meeting of the 13th of January 1972, discussing homelessness. We've got at tab 22, a meeting on the 1st of February. You're presenting a report with a colleague about Ireland, the thrust of which is a plea to end sectarianism. At tab 23, we've got the National Council of Young Liberals meeting. We've got at tab 24, a meeting discussing in your front living room again, I think, but this time 94 Park Road, low income groups, old age pensioners, and population control. And at tab 28, the theme of the meeting appears to be pollution occasioned by motor cars and the pollution of water. I could go on, but I think you get the drift.
Yes, what I'm not clear about is where this line of questioning is leading. You started off with minor criminality, and then you go on to talk about homelessness and old age pensions and getting rid of pollution in London and so on, and other cities.
The paradox is,
what's the point?
The paradox is this: to what extent, in meetings of the Young Liberals, was non-violent direct action being discussed?
Oh, it was. And there's no question about that. But what's wrong with it? What is wrong with non-violent direct action?
I am not taking issue with that at all.
Except that you proceeded, you gave it the label criminal, and then when I pressed you, minor criminal.
I am, what I'm getting at is I'm trying to gauge how extensive was non-violent direct action within the Young Liberals.
Well, amongst a section of the Young Liberals, it was. I mean, the Young Liberals themselves consisted of junior Liberals of the more conventional kind, and then the Young Liberals of the late 60s that were a more radical force of which I was part. But what you can tell I object to about this line of questioning is when it comes to progressive radical movements, whether it's environmentalists today, whether it's anti-racists, Black Lives Matter, whether it's Greenpeace or Extinction Rebellion or the anti-apartheid movement of its era, we're all presented as somehow subversive or semi-criminal or objectionable or disrupting England's clean and present land, green and pleasant land. And actually, that pejorative prism through which radical politics is presented is, in my view, completely unacceptable, reprehensible and partisan. And that is the sort of perspective that undercover policing and the ideology that was driving it. That's my major concern. And I think, I'm not accusing you personally, but I think you're reflecting that state of mind, if I may say so.
Well, what I'm coming to is this. If we've got a group which is discussing non-violent direct action, which includes some minor criminality, if they don't use an undercover police officer, how else do they find out about it and stop it?
Well, you've got to decide on, what is the point of the police here? The point of the police, and I've worked with the police as a cabinet minister, as a local MP for a quarter of a century, indeed as a member of the House of Lords. For 2 years when I was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I was protected by armed officers from the Metropolitan Police. So I'm a supporter of the function of good policing in maintaining a civilized society. But are you really saying that police resources were best deployed in virtually every meeting of Putney Young Liberals, sometimes less than half a dozen people, discussing all manner of worthy issues, I would think, like old age pensions and environmental pollution? Are you really saying that that's a sensible policy for undercover policing to do that kind of thing? Because you then get into the world that undercover police officers, and this is something that I'd like to return to, if I may, at the end of today's evidence, Sir John. Undercover policing then gets to the point where instead of catching the racists responsible for Stephen Lawrence's murder, they infiltrate the Lawrence campaign and the family campaign. So instead of dealing with a lot of the issues of injustice in society, what they're doing is attending meetings of Putney Young Liberals, when no doubt thieves were going about Putney robbing houses at the time. That's what they should have been doing, combating proper crime and drug trafficking and terrorism, not harassing legitimate radical opinion.
Thank you, Lord Hain. Now, I did say I would show you one report. Could we have up, please, UCPI 608240. So this is at tab 21 of your bundle. This is a report on the Putney Young Liberals. The meeting is the 20th of January 1972. It's at 94 Park Road. This is a different address, but I think it's right, isn't it? This is still your parents' home. They just moved.
Yeah, they'd moved there in the meantime. Yes.
Was I right to assume the meetings are still happening in the front room?
They are, yes, rather overused front room.
There are 14 people, according to this report, in the front room. Now, this is the subject of the report, you can take it from me, is environmental matters, including a proposed assault on the Battersea smell. And we see towards the bottom of the page what I'm interested in. If you could scroll down, please. Nominations were taken for the executive posts of chairman, secretary, treasurer, and membership secretary, and the following persons were elected to those positions. The membership secretary goes to Mike Scott. That is HN 298, an undercover police officer. Can you recall any of this?
I don't recall the name Mike Scott. Certainly, if there was a Reverend Mike Scott involved in the anti-apartheid movement, a very respected figure, but I don't recall a name Mike Scott. So he must have operated under another name for the purposes of becoming, if that's what he did, the membership secretary. And to be frank, I can't remember the membership secretary's name all these years later.
And this is of the Putney branch of the Young Liberals.
Yeah.
We've got plenty of evidence of SDS undercover officers assuming positions within the groups they're infiltrating. But I'd value your view as an experienced politician about whether or not there are any particular dangers arising from an undercover police officer assuming a position within a mainstream political organisation.
Yes, I do think that should be of real concern to this inquiry, because what were we discussing? According to this note, and presumably that's the case, a brief discussion followed about representatives to the annual conference of the National Young Liberals, perfectly democratic, perfectly mainstream. So I do think your question, and I'm grateful for it, invites the issue about what was an undercover policing officer doing in the youth branch of a major political party. Indeed, that underlines the point I made throughout, that this is a misuse of police resources.
And could we go over the page, please, to see who was at the meeting? I'll just remind you of the date, Lord Hain, which you'll need for the purposes of my next questions. 26th of January, 1972. Joanne Hain is one of your sisters.
She is.
How old was Joanne Hain on the 26th of January, 1972?
She was born in 1956, so she would have been 15 at the time, because her 16th birthday hadn't happened.
Sally Hain, another of your siblings.
She was born in 1958, so she would have been 13 at the time, because her birthday hadn't happened. So they were young teenagers.
Do you have any concerns, putting to one side whether or not there was any justification for infiltrating the Young Liberals at all? Do you have any concerns about reporting on children?
I do. I'm not sure, to be fair, that my sisters as young teenagers would have seen themselves as children, but I do have concerns indeed about precisely that. And I think it's come up elsewhere in this inquiry.
Indeed it has. Would you like to articulate what those concerns might be?
Well, it comes to my constant theme, and I hope I'm not boring the inquiry, because that's not my intention, about disproportionate, politically biased policing here. And in the case of young people, these were schoolgirls attending Mayfield Comprehensive School at the time in Putney, and they were following their elder brother and their own wishes in being part of a progressive youth organization. And they'd been involved in Stop the 72 activity as well. So I really don't understand why Mike Scott was in this meeting at all, how it could be justified by his superiors, and what he was doing with particularly two young women teenagers. Sorry, I'm not by that casting any aspersions at any of his behavior might have been towards my sisters, because I don't recall any misbehavior in that respect. I didn't want to leave a smear.
Thank you. Could we take that down now, please? I'm going to move on now to the campaign for the repeal of the Immigration Act. And you've made clear that you don't recall the campaign and don't think you spoke at a meeting that the documents say you were invited to go to. But what I'd like to do is call up the document at tab 44, please, which is UCPI 607658, please. Thank you very much. Now this, Lord Hain, is an SDS report, as we can see from the stamp at the top right of the page, about the campaign for the repeal of the Immigration Act, as we can see from the acronym on the left-hand margin. It's a form of report that we're familiar with. It's a report about an individual. And it says, privacy redaction, who is an active member of the campaign for the repeal of the Immigration Act, 1971, is employed in an administrative capacity by the British Gas Corporation, Michael Street, London, SW6. And then we have his telephone number. Privacy and his wife, Privacy, devote a considerable amount of time to the running and building of CRIA, recently asked Peter Hain of the Young Liberals to speak at future CRIA public meetings and encourage the Young Liberals to actively support the campaign. Privacy and Privacy have previously come to our notice in connection with CRIA. Peter Hain is the subject of, and then there is a reference number for the registry file relating to you. First of all, insofar as you know anything about the CRIA, was it involved in any serious criminality?
I don't recall it as being, or any, by your earlier definition, minor sort of public disorder. I don't recall it, but I don't recall the organization with great detail. What I do recall is a great deal of opposition to what many of us felt was a racist Immigration Act of 1971 brought in by the Conservative government, which was presumably what is concerned here.
I've got two further points I'd like your reaction on. The first is you are reported, your name appears in this report because you've been asked, simply been asked to speak at a public meeting. Do you have any reaction to reporting you for that level of contact?
Thank you. Yes, I do, because this is again an example of bias in policing and the deployment of undercover officers. If you have a file on you, which is presumably what that reference is, a special branch file was held on me at the time, then quite gratuitously you get involved, and it sort of creates an atmosphere, especially through undercover officers, of some kind of murky subversion going on here. Whereas this is a perfectly legitimate public meeting, publicly advertised, as far as I can tell, to protest about a legitimate cause, which is the operation of what a lot of people felt at the time, including me, was a racist form of immigration legislation. So I do object to it, and it's another example along a long list of biased, disproportionate deployment of police undercover officers.
And the second final question on this document is the husband and wife couple here appear to be reported upon for two reasons. One, their involvement in the campaign for the repeal of the Immigration Act, and two, because they've asked you to speak. Do you have any comment on reporting them for asking you to speak at a public meeting?
Well, yes, I do, really. I mean, I don't know the names, and I don't know whether they are in themselves of interest to the police. But if they weren't, as seems possible, if not likely, then they get dragged into this simply because I am a name that the police have an interest in for entirely nefarious motives, in my view. And because of my anti-apartheid, anti-racist activity in the main, or overwhelmingly, and simply because I'm invited to a meeting, suddenly a police file is opened on them. It's this kind of octopus-like form of activity that really drags the police, and undercover policing in particular, undercover officers, into areas which I think are completely illegitimate.
We get a part of an answer to the question you posed a moment ago at paragraph 4. It says privacy and privacy have previously come to our notice in connection with CRIA. So it appears that was our only previous connection, as far as we can tell from this report.
But again, what is wrong with an organization campaigning against an immigration legislation? You might or might not agree with them. You or I might not, or might agree with them, but why are the police interested in them? I mean, that's the question I have continuously. There's a evidence, I think, given to this inquiry earlier on, reported in the media, of an undercover officer involved in the attending meetings of the Women's Liberation Organization around this kind of time, between 1971 and 73. Her undercover name was Sandra, and she told the inquiry, I think on the 18th of May, I could have been doing much more valuable things with my time. She attended meetings where there were 2 or 3 activists there. But then she said this, and I think it's really important, that there was a very different view towards the women's movement then compared to today, and I'm quoting. And she said, I don't think that her work really yielded any good intelligence. And I suspect this was true here again, attending meetings of Putney Young Liberals, discussing environmental pollution, or meetings of the campaign for repeal of the Immigration Act, or meetings of the Women's Liberation Organization. What on earth are undercover officers doing? It's a precious resource of great skill. I've worked with undercover officers in my time in Northern Ireland, combating terrorism and paramilitary violence and bombings and assassinations, and they're brave people. But what on earth are they doing involved in this kind of these kinds of organizations, about arguments about racism in immigration, or women's rights, or environmental pollution?
Thank you, Lord Hain. So would that be a convenient moment to break for lunch?
Yes, it would. Before we do, may I just raise 2 matters with Lord Hain? First of all, can I explain to you Mr. Barr's task? It is not merely to elicit your evidence and to put it to a proper test where it's necessary, but he is also told by representatives of other core participants, including police, what topics they would like raised with you. Consequently, some of the time, it rather sounds as if he's advancing a line that the inquiry has. That's a misconception.
I'm glad to hear it.
Secondly, this, I take this opportunity to ask, with apologies for spoiling your lunch break, for you to check briefly through the documents produced by Mike Ferguson about the Stop the 70s tour. You have frequently and vehemently disputed the assertion made on the True Spies programme that it was ever suggested that tax be put on the pitch at a rugby match. There is, I think, no written record of any such suggestion. The suggestion comes from a man who is also now dead, Wilf, on a programme where he was, I think, trying to put the SDS in a good light and to tell it as entertainingly as it could be for the benefit of the television programme. And therefore, we simply do not have any reliable first-hand evidence about what Mike Ferguson reported and did beyond the written reports that we have. And I wanted to ask you, if I may, briefly to go over again the written reporting that he's produced, and to identify in it those bits which you say are inaccurate.
I'll happily do that.
You have, I think, already done it, but I want to ensure that I've got it right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's now 1:05, so we'll break until 2:05, and Mr. Fernandez will announce that.
We will now take a break for lunch. May I remind those in the virtual hearing room to remember to join your breakout rooms. The time is now 1:05 p.m, so we shall resume at 2:05 p.m. Thank you.